So, welcome everyone to our third keynote session. But before we start, there are a couple of announcements. The first one is that those who have taken your name badges but haven't registered, please do so, because otherwise you won't have your conference dinner tickets. And another one is from Marco Pasi, is about General Assembly. Everybody is welcome. It's not only for the representatives of national organization, it's for everyone. So you're welcome. But now I have a pleasure and honor to introduce Professor David Thurfjell from Södertörn University, Sweden. And David is a historian and ethnographer of religion. He has wide scope of research interests. He started in ethnographic studies of Islamist revivalism, then moved on to Pentecostal studies and did ethnography of Christian revivalism among Romani people, and also then turned to the field of Scandinavian secularity, and in 2015 he published a book titled The Godless People. And presently he is working on one project about nature spirituality among secular Scandinavians and Estonians, and is writing a book titled People of the Spruce Forest, How Nature Became the Religion of the Swedes. But the keynote, however, will be based on his second ongoing project on secular Swedes with a Muslim family background. So please, David.
Thank you very much, Atko. The sound system here, can you hear me there in the back? Yes? So thank you very much, Atko, and thank you to the conference organizers for this beautifully organized conference. So I will talk about my own country, Sweden, and I will speak about a situation that has now become the case in that country, namely that Sweden, according to certain sociological measures, at the same time can be counted as the most secular country in Europe and the most multi-religious. And this interface between an increased multi-religious situation, and I will focus on the Muslim minority groups, and a secular sort of mainstream culture is the interface that I'm interested in and that I will address in this talk. And the disposition of the talk will basically be that I will divide what I will have to say in two parts. So first I will speak on, in broad strokes, about the sort of the history of what I call then the post-Lutheran situation in Scandinavian countries and in Sweden. And I will, having this sort of described the rather peculiar religious situation of the mainstream population in this country, I will move on to say something about these new Muslim immigrants and present some results from a survey that we have been doing lately. Okay, so let's begin then with the first of these two. If you speak about the history of the Scandinavian countries and the history of Sweden and their alleged secularity, it is really important to remember from where these countries came. And one has to remember that Sweden as a nation comes from a history where the church was of immense importance to the state. It is fair to say that Sweden was a country that had a state church, but it's even fairer to say that Sweden was a country that was a church, because the Lutheran state church in the 17th and 18th centuries, up until quite recently, ran many of the things that the state had to do in general. So the church was responsible for the administration of justice, the church was responsible for health care and such services, the church was responsible for land surveillance, the church was responsible for education and universities, like this university, which was founded under Swedish rule in the 17th century. And this situation then, with an exceptionally strong church, created also some legal consequences for the citizens. One has to remember that the 17th century was a time before the idea of the nation state, and that the sort of common identity that bound the Swedish realm together was this Lutheran Christian identity. So it was compulsory to be baptized. It was compulsory to go to the communion. It was obligatory for all citizens to be knowledgeable about the small catechism of Luther, which was sort of the summary of his teachings. There were state-employed priests coming to each and every household, examining the people on their knowledge on Luther and his teachings. So this was a strong religious regime, and it means that to be a Swede was to be a Lutheran, I mean, almost juridically defined. Sweden had some small colonies. It wasn't much of a colonial empire, but it had some small attempts at colonizing different places in the world. And there was one small colony in North America, and there was a Native American population living in this little colony. So the small catechism of Luther was translated to their language, since they were, by definition, Lutherans, since they were a part of this Lutheran realm. There's a story of a camel keeper who came from Anatolia, from the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, and he came to Stockholm, and it was realized soon that he was actually not a Lutheran Christian but a Muslim. So he was baptized then immediately in order to be able to be present in the country at all. He was given the name Nils, which is a very Swedish name, but he was sort of baptized into Swedishness. Okay. And then, of course, so this is the background, a very strong Christian regime. And from the mid-19th century onwards, what we see in Sweden is a development where this complete unity of the church and the state has slowly sort of crumbled, and there has been this process of separation and secularization of the state. And this can most clearly be followed if you follow the legal situation and the laws. And we can see in Swedish history, I don't have time to go into the details, but from the 1860s onwards, every 10 years or so there will be passed a new law which contributes to the separation of the church and state. So the church loses its role as the administrator of justice, it loses the health care responsibility, the school, the monopoly, and so on and so forth. So at the end, we get sort of a situation where Sweden can rightly be called one of the most secular countries. In some surveys, when you ask people in Sweden to what extent religion, if religion has a position in their life whatsoever, in certain surveys, 72% say absolutely not. In some surveys, 85% say that religion has no position in their everyday lives. If you ask people if they believe that God exists, about 15 to 20% say yes to this question. So very low scores in belief in God. And if you see how many people go to church on an average Sunday, it's about 1.2%. So we can rightly say that Sweden is a really highly secular country, and that the majority population has a very strong secular identity. But it's not as easy as one would think when it comes to these things. Because as we as scholars of religion know, religion can mean many things. When people speak about religion, they can speak about ethnicity, they can speak about belief, about traditions, about juridical categories. And usually when people in survey studies report on religion or their own religion, what they report, of course, is their ideal and their self-image, rather than their actual practice. And when we study then the growth of sort of people that deny a religious connection, and the growth of non-religion, if you want to use that word, we can see, well, I just want to show one more thing. This is, perhaps you've seen this, the World Value Survey map of secularity and the strength of secular rational values and self-expression values. And on this map, which reflects this super secularity, much to the secret pride of many Swedes, Sweden is positioned up there in the top right corner. But it's not so easy, because when you are studying the growth of secularity or secular identity, or the growth of non-religion, one way this could be dependent on different things. So if we take a chart like this, and this chart then shows, the level of religiosity. Then we will probably find some kind of even distribution bell curve like this, and you would have some degree of the population that you would call religious and others that you would call non-religious. So if we see that the growth of people who deny a religious affiliation, this could mean that the actual level of religiosity, whether it's, confessed belief or church going, church attendance or whatever we want to measure it by, sort of decreases. So in that case, the field of non-religion would grow because there simply is less religion. But the growth of non-religion could also be the result of a changed definition of what counts as religion. So if you change the definition, you will get the same effect. And then the question becomes, what is it that has happened in Sweden when people have become so increasingly secularized? Phrased differently, we could ask, what is it people deny when they deny religion? And of course, probably the answer to this is that both of these processes have happened, but I will focus now on the latter aspect, because if we think of a sort of redefinition of what people put into the term religion, or actually in the Swedish case into Christianity, and into words like belief and church and all these sort of terms that cluster together under the umbrella term of religion or Christianity, if we think of it as a change, sort of semantic change, well, then our study of secularization will have to become a study of language and discourse and the meaning of words in people's lives. And if we go back then to the Swedish material and the alleged secularity of Swedish people, and we sort of look at it with this semantic language aspect in mind, there are certain things, certain presuppositions that we can question. So firstly, I would like to question two of these presuppositions. And the first one is the idea that there's a major difference between the past and the present. And the second presupposition that one can question is that there's a major difference between the religious and the secular. So there is an idea, if we take the first one first, there is an idea among secular Swedes that there is a vast difference between the past and the present. If you make interviews with people about religion in their lives and among this secular Swedish people, it's an oft-repeated phrase that we are such a secular people, we don't have religion anymore. This is a part of the self-understanding. And the story I just told about how Sweden moved from a very highly religious Lutheran-governed country with the state church to one of the most secular countries in the world, that story is well known. The story that is reflected among Swedish people, and that story is also, as I showed, reflected in research, among other things, the World Value Survey. But if you look at the statistics, we can see that the difference between the past and the present actually are not as obvious or as big as one would anticipate. So, for instance, I said that the number of people who say that they believe that God exists is actually it's between 15 and 23%. So about 20% of people say that they think God exists, which is very low. But if you ask the question differently, as they did in the last wave of World Value Survey, for instance, if you ask, do you believe in God, without the exist, then we have more than 40% saying yes. So there are twice as many people believing in God as though believing God exists in this country. And if you add to that number those who say that they believe in a higher power or life force, well, then we get a number at between 60 and 70%. And suddenly Sweden is not as particularly sort of atheist as it would seem. So we can take another thing then, so that's belief. The belief is not as clear as it would seem. And also I should say about belief that this is not changing. The level of belief since the 1980s at least is quite steady if you include the category of believing in a higher power or life force. Also, we could take the case of church attendance. There's this notion in Sweden that people used to go to church all the time, and now no one goes to church. This is an oft-repeated phrase. I mean, you hear it all the time. And it's there what comes through in our interviews as well. And I suppose the same idea can be found in the other Nordic countries. But if you look at the statistics of church attendance on an average Sunday over the last decade, the chart looks like this. So this is a chart for Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. So we can see that the level of church attendance has been exceptionally low for most of the 20th century. Actually, as far back as there are numbers that can measure this. The purple line, I don't know if you can see, it's Denmark, and if you Danes think that at least the Danes went a little bit more to church in 1935, that is actually wrong, because there's a data thing there that makes the Copenhagen region not being included in the first figure. So it's been extremely low for 100 years at least. And if you look at the, reports from priests and bishops, the clergy have been complaining about people not coming to church in Sweden for as long back as we can follow. So maybe the difference between the past and the present is not as apparent as people would claim. So then let's look then at the idea of a clear difference between the religious and the secular. Now, this in the self-understanding, the way we speak about this, the way we talk about it as scholars and also in the public debate, there is a clear understanding of a difference between the religious and the secular, obviously. This is a dichotomy. When the religious grows, we think the secular will be pushed away and vice versa. And this, of course, might be the case. But what happens if we look at the specific religious tradition that has dominated in Scandinavia and in Sweden, which is Lutheran state church Christianity? Well, it would be an extreme simplification if we now talk about the 19th century and the sort of different variants of Christianity and Judaism in Europe in those days. It would be a simplification to speak of the 19th century as a struggle between secular forces and religious forces. It's a more accurate description to say that there were a number of various secularities, obviously, but also a number of sort of religious stances. And one way to map the religious landscape of the 19th century in Europe is to speak of three camps. And I borrow this from David Sorkin, who's an historian of Jewish history from America. So you can divide it in three camps. You would have the dogmatic camp, the revivalist camp, and the Enlightenment camp. And he is focused on theology. So dogmatic theology, revivalist theology, and Enlightenment theology. And the Enlightenment theologians were those Christians and Jews, thinkers, who sort of shared in many of the critiques against religion that was formulated by the Enlightenment thinkers. So the Enlightenment theologians, they wanted to combine Christianity with Enlightenment ideas about equality between humans, for instance. And they wanted to combine their Christian tradition with a historical understanding of the Bible, and also with a natural scientific understanding of the world. And they were, of course, contested by other types of Christianity, but this was a strand. And in the Swedish case, this strand was most clearly formulated, or sort of the most clear expression of this was something called the Young Church Movement and the Folk Church Movement, which has had enormous impact on the Swedish Christian situation. And here you see some famous people who represented this folk church idea. One of them is actually a colleague who is also a historian of religion, Nathan Söderblom, on the left side there. And these theologians, what they did many things, and I would mention two of them. And one was to take the old sort of state church Christian identity. So from the old empire days, Lutheran Christianity was the identity that defined the people in the Swedish nation. So they took this old idea of Christian being everyone who was included in the Swedish nation, and they combined this with a new type of identity stories that were being formulated from the 19th century onwards, namely the idea of the nation state and the idea of a people and a folk and an ethnic unity of people. So they created the idea of the folk church. And they provided this, they took this idea of the folk church, and they also gave it a sort of a theological superstructure, which was Lutheran. So they would argue, because they had a situation where people didn't really come to church, they had this cultural affinity, they had this background of an empire, the Lutheran Empire, and they provided a theological sort of argument for this type of Christianity, this broad understanding that who is a Christian, the people of Sweden is a Christian people, things like this. And the theological argument was this, that the Church of Sweden, the Swedish Lutheran Church, is a Lutheran church. And the main argument of Luther, or sort of main phrase, of course, is this sola gratia, the idea that we are saved by grace alone. And if you have a Lutheran church that preaches that we are saved by grace alone, this means that God, according to the Lutheran teaching, does not ask anything in return. God is not giving his grace only to those who deserve it, who are pious and make ritual things and come to church. He gives his grace and paradise and whatever to everyone, regardless whether they have made themselves worthy of it or not. And if this is the way God is, then the church, which is the body of God in the world, according to their terminology, should reflect this idea. So the church, according to the folk church theologians, is there for everyone, regardless whether they have made themselves deserving of it or not. So the church is there for drunkards and alcoholics and criminals, but it's also there, and this is the most radical thing, it's also there for those, religiously uninterested, middle-class, urban Stockholm people who don't care or know anything about it. So this is the idea of the folk church. And they made this principle called the Territorial Principle, which means that a church in every city or village, or there will be a church, and that church is responsible for everyone who is in that area. Okay. Now, what happened in Sweden was that this idea, the idea that the church, you can formulate the folk church movement as an answer to the question of who may be called a Christian. Who is a Christian? What do we mean by a Christian in this Lutheran post-empire state church situation? And the folk church people, they argued that the Christian is everyone who is a part of this community. So we, all the Swedes who are baptized and friendly people, we are the Christians, regardless of how religious we are. And this strand of theology then became the major strand of theology in the Church of Sweden. And it's the official position of this church still today, and it has been for the major part of the 20th century. Now, their broad understanding of who was a Christian was, of course, challenged by others. And one of the major challenges during the 20th century came from revivalist Christians. Now we come back to David Sorkin's different types of theology in Europe. And the Pentecostal movement was a movement that was quite important in forming the Swedish debate about Christianity. And the Pentecostals and the revivalist Christians, they had a completely different idea about who was a Christian, a different answer to the question who may be called a Christian. They said that a Christian is not anyone who is a part of this wider national community. A Christian is someone who has sort of taken Christ into his heart and met redemption and made a major change in his life. Baptism, the baptism of the Lutheran State Church did not count as baptism for the Pentecostals. This cultural Christian identity does not count as real Christianity by the Pentecostals and other revivalist movements. One of the famous preachers from the 19th century was a man called Carl Olof Rosenius. He called the people of Sweden, and I directly translate, he called it, the people of Sweden consists of hordes, quote, hordes of baptized heathens that rage towards destruction. The cultural Christians are not real Christians. The revivalist people are. Now what happens then in Sweden, to make a long story short, is that there was a cultural debate in the 40s and 50s that completely changed the way people started to speak about religion in the Swedish public debate. And in this public debate, which was about, it was called the knowing and believing debate, there was a new sort of position that was being formulated. And that was the position of what we can call atheists. So scientific arguments against religion. So what happens then in the 40s and the 50s in Sweden is that we have one position that is the state church Christianity. The folk church idea, a very broad Lutheran understanding of who is a Christian and what Christianity means. It's this cultural affinity that you don't have to do anything to deserve. And this is challenged by a narrow understanding of Christian as someone who has a strong belief in God, proposed by the Pentecostals, for instance. Now, the third stance that is formulated in the 40s and 50s is this atheist critique of religion, a secular humanistic critique of religion, which criticizes religion for being unscientific and unhumane and all kinds of things that we can recognize from today's debate also. But the thing is, when these secular atheists criticized Christianity, the Christianity they had in mind was not this sort of vague state church Lutheranism, but it was the more narrow understanding of Christianity that was promoted by the Pentecostals. And this creates a certain dynamic in the public debate about religion. Because the Pentecostals, this is a bit schematic as you see, but just to make the point, the Pentecostals believe that Jesus walked on water. The atheists, the secular atheists, believe that he didn't walk on water. Okay, so they had completely different stances, but they had the same idea of what it was like, what Christianity was about. So they could challenge it. They don't believe he walked on water, they believe he walked on water, but at least they could fight, they could have a straight fight. Whereas the vague Enlightenment Theological Lutheran state church just became some kind of vagueness for both these people. Because they would not be creationists, they would not have a literalist understanding of the Bible. They would actually be quite similar to the secular atheists in their understanding of the world, which made a very confusing case for the atheists and an equally confusing case for the Pentecostals. Okay, so this is the dynamics in the 40s in Sweden. And what happened was that in this debate, which was this big cultural debate in the 40s, the state church Lutheran Enlightenment bishops had to defend Christianity, but the Christianity they had to defend was a Pentecostal version of it, a strict, dogmatic, revivalist Christianity that they did not stand for themselves. And they failed miserably in this. So what happened then in the 40s in this debate was that the bishops in the Church of Sweden lost this cultural debate, and by losing it, they lost their status, they lost their sort of intellectual credibility. They were made to look like fools in the public opinion. But they also lost, and this is sort of the main point then for this argument, they also lost the prerogative of interpretation. So after this debate, when people in Sweden started to think about what it means to be Christian, they would not think about this broad identity, cultural identity, all us, the Swedes who are baptized and friendly people, but they started to think of Christian in a more narrow sense, the narrow sense that they had then taken from both the revivalist Pentecostals and from the secular atheists. And this loss then of the prerogative of interpretation of the folk church theologians was one of the things that created this very peculiar situation that we have, which is a standard situation among the Swedish mainstream population. And that is that they have Christian names. Most of them are baptized. They have married in church. They have they will bury their dead in the church. They celebrate Easter and Christmas. And they actually believe in a higher power or life force in a vague way, quite similar to the one that is being preached by their bishops. And they also are paying members. Almost 70% of the Swedish population are paying members of this state church. So they fulfill all these criteria on being Christians, but they would never think of themselves as Christians because they are not like the Pentecostals. Okay. So this creates the situation where you have quite a strong affinity to cultural Christianity, a greater continuity with the past than people would think. Okay. Now, this situation then, this idea where this sort of lack of connection to a religion that you have in at least a cultural and also Lutheran sense. This creates certain dynamics in the encounter of people coming from other religions. Because if, let's say we were all post-Lutheran, state church, middle-class Swedish people, uninterested in religion, taking in that we don't believe God exists, but we believe in Him, but we don't believe He exists. I mean, fulfilling the criteria of this majority culture. If we belong to that group who would not recognize ourselves as having a religion, and a a Pakistani person would come into the room. Let's say a Pakistani woman who would wear a scarf, perhaps, who would give her sons names like Muhammad, who would celebrate Eid, who would eat in according to Islamic tradition, who would celebrate, life, right, holidays, and other things in Islamic tradition. We would then, this is what I've argued in an interview study that I did on this, we would then immediately recognize this woman as an instance of religion. I mean, this is a Muslim. Why does she celebrate Eid? Because she's Muslim. Why does she call her son Muhammad? Because she's Muslim. Why does she have these patterns of thinking concerning religion? Perhaps because she's Muslim. She's obviously Muslim. She's a case of religion. Islam is a religion, and she is sort of formed by that religion, and that explains why she is as the way she is. And then we would transfer this, but then when we look at ourselves, if we belong to this group, we will not see the same thing. We will not use the label of religion in a similar way. Why do we celebrate Christmas? It has nothing to do with Christianity, we will say. Why do we have a cross in our flag? It has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a tradition. Why do we call our children names like Peter and John and Mary? It has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a tradition. Of course, because we define Christianity in a narrow sense that, we could, but we define it differently when it comes to Christianity and other religions. So there is sort of an asymmetrical way of using the label of religion when looking at oneself and when looking at others. So this is the first sort of scene then. Now, into this cultural post-Christian mindset and majority culture comes Muslim immigrants. So I now move on to the second section of this talk. And if we speak about Muslim immigrants, we can see that Sweden as a nation has gone through a very dramatic demographical change. The number of Muslims, and I will use this word now within quotation marks for reasons that you will come to know soon. The number of Muslims have changed since the 1970s from about 0% to 8% of the population. And there are estimations that the Muslim part of the Swedish population will continue to grow. The biggest immigrant countries that people have come from are Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Bosnia. Previously and during the last years, we've had big immigration waves from Syria and Afghanistan, among other countries. The Pew Research Institute, which is one of these survey institutes, they have made a prognosis of the Muslim populations in many European countries. And their prognosis for the future, and this is then their prognosis for the year 2050, is that Sweden will have about 20% Muslims among the population. They have three scenarios, and they stretch from 11 with zero immigration to 30% with a high level of immigration. So this one, if their prognosis is correct, well, Sweden then will be the country in Western Europe with the largest percentage of Muslims. Now, the idea that we get in our head, or that the Pew Research Institute sort of also portrays with this type of maps, is that the Muslims are the immigrants that come from the Middle East. This is the picture that they use on their report where they have this map. So these are the Muslims, people coming from Syria and other countries into Europe. Now, it becomes important, given this demographical change, it becomes an important task for us as scholars of religion to try to understand this. What happens in this meeting between these Muslims and these this largely secular, but in a very ambiguous and specific way, people that you find in Scandinavia. And so one question then would be how religious the Muslims, that is the people coming that are reported to become 20% in Sweden, how religious are they? I mean, what kind of, are they religious? Are they secular? What's their status? And there are some statistics about this, also from Pew Research Center, based on a number of different surveys. And I will now focus on the countries of Bosnia, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, since these are the four big Muslim immigrant communities in Sweden. And there have been surveys testing a number of different ideas concerning religion. I will not go through all of this. But one thing, for instance, is the idea to what extent people answer yes to the question, do you believe Sharia should be the official law of your country? And to this question, we can see that there are huge regional differences. There are huge regional and generational differences concerning all of these questions. On the question of Sharia, Bosnia and Turkey have 15% and 12% respectively, but Iraq has 74%. There is a huge backing of the idea of religious freedom, about 90% in all the countries. But there's also a strong religious belief. If you ask people in these surveys if they believe in God and in Muhammad as the prophet of God, almost 100% will say yes to this question. So there seems to be evidence then from previous surveys that Muslims in the Muslim world are religious to a much larger extent than Swedes then. At the same time, we have to remember that if we focus on these four countries, then Bosnia, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, these are countries that in their 20th century have been ruled by people like these four gentlemen. So Tito, Ataturk, Saddam Hussein, and the Pahlavi Shahs of Iran. So these are secular leaders, various forms of secular leaders. And if you look at the history of Turkey and Bosnia and Iran and Iraq, they have all been governed by quite strong secular regimes, perhaps not liberal and democratic, but secular. So these people are not new. I mean, secularity is not a new thing for them. Actually, it could be argued that they have much vaster experience of secular societies, at least in a political sense, than Swedes do. Okay. And before I go on then to say something about a survey, it is important to remember that there are many forces, or many there are many who has it in their interest to describe the Muslims, the people coming, the future 20% of Sweden, as Muslims. This is in the interest of many groups in our society. One group is Muslim community leaders, imams and Muslim community leaders who want to make themselves or see themselves as the representatives of these Muslims. It's in their interest to describe these people as Muslim. It's also in the interest of some immigration hostile politicians and demagogues to argue that the immigrants are Muslims and to use this religious category to speak of them as Muslims. It could also be, and we have to be careful here, in the interest of scholars of religion like ourselves to describe people by using the religious category, because that will sort of be the category that we as scholars of religion have something to say about. It would be less interesting for us if they were described as plumbers or something else. And it's also, given this sort of post-Lutheran situation, also a part of the situation, at least in Sweden, that is where this othering of religion is going on, where Muslims are seen as more Muslim than Christians as Christian, regardless of what they think themselves. So there are many forces that want us to think of these people as Muslims. So what we have done now, and I will present now a survey that we have been conducting. We have been trying to study to what extent these people, that is, people in Sweden who have a Muslim family background, who have come from Bosnia, Turkey, Iran and Iraq mostly, but also other countries, to what extent they are religious and what Islam means to them and what it what it is like to be a Muslim in this specific post-Lutheran context. And I will say now something about the results of this survey. The project is called the Muslim Mainstream because we want to grasp as many people with who could be labeled Muslim in the sort of broadest possible sense of the word. The Muslim Mainstream, it's a project funded by 2 Swedish research councils. And besides myself, Anna Buren, who's an ethnographer, is a part of the project, and Erika Welander, who is a statistician and a quantitative sociologist. And these 2 on the small pictures are the ones who've actually conducted the survey. They are sociologists and statisticians from Gothenburg University. Okay, so in this survey, what we have done is, and now I'll say something about methodology, we will have 3 types of data collection. So first we have a web panel survey, and a web panel is a panel where people have volunteered to be a part, to answer questionnaires. And a web panel is good because you can expect a high response rate, a large number of people answering your questionnaires. But it has a flaw, and that is that it's a bias that people have volunteered to be a part of it. So it loses its validity, it's less representative, but you get a higher response rate. And then we will have a postal survey, which has the opposite situation. It will be more representative, but nowadays you cannot expect the response rate to be particularly high. We expect to get a response rate about 25 or 30%, which is another problem. And then we will continue with focus group interviews. Okay, and what we've done so far is the web panel survey. So what I will tell you now is what comes from the web panel survey. So this is based on a collection then of people who have volunteered to answer surveys. They come from all parts of Sweden, all classes and ages, and a very wide collection of people. It's 60,000 volunteers altogether in this web panel. And we have asked them first a screening question, in order to find people with a Muslim family background. And we chose the family background as the sort of independent variable because this is actually what we thought was the most strongest thing. You could have gone for belief or traditions or something, but we have family background as the most defining case of being Muslim. So we asked, what religions do you have in your family today and in previous generations? And we had 900 people from this group who ticked Islam, who claimed to have Islam as a family religion. And then we made comparative populations. So based on age, sex, and level of education, we made sort of a comparative population with people who had ticked Christianity and no religion. And in total, we sent out about 2,700 surveys, and we got a response rate of 85%, which is very good in this type of survey standard. So we have lots of questionnaires being filled in, and in total we have a data set with 2,150 questionnaires. And I should just say that what we have studied here, the language is Swedish, so this is not a study of people who have just recently arrived from Syria or Afghanistan or somewhere. This is established people, Swedish people, not necessarily citizens, but people living in Sweden, being able to answer in Swedish, and who are sort of somehow a part of the Swedish society. Okay. The questions we wanted to ask these people were, firstly we asked about the traditional question you ask when you study religion in this type of sociological questionnaires. So questions about affiliation. What do you call yourself? Do you have what's your family, religion, and so on? Questions about belief, and also questions about practice. What holidays do you celebrate? Do you pray? This kind of stuff. But then, in order to sort of circumvent this post-Lutheran othering of Christianity, or othering of religion situation in the Swedish context, we also added questions about appreciation, importance, and ascription, which means, like the question, do you like Christianity? Do you like Islam? How do you, even if you believe it or belong to it, do you like it? Is it a positive or a negative? What's your feelings about these traditions? What's the importance of religion in your life? And also to what extent are you being ascribed a religion that you don't feel that you adhere to yourself? So questions about this we also asked. And I will now give you 5 preliminary findings. And they are preliminary because they are only based on the web panel survey, and they will have to be filled or sort of completed with results from the postal survey. So first, one first result of this study is that if you make one of these factor analysis where you sort of combine, see what different response patterns cluster together in underlying factors, and based on that you find clusters in among the respondents, we find that the people who answer the questionnaire, they cluster in 4 different clusters. And we have called these secular post-Christians. So these are people who have a Christian family background and perhaps a Christian upbringing, but who are not, they don't feel like Christian, they don't call themselves Christian, they are secular post-Christians. And then we have Christianity-affirming Christians. Those are the Christians who like Christianity and perhaps also have a Christian belief, or sort of more actively Christians. Then we have secular post-Muslims, and we have Islam-affirming Muslims. So these are the 4 categories that stand out in the material and that sort of cluster together as groups that actually we can prove exist there in the data. Now, when you study the relation between these 4 groups, you can speak of something like an unrequited love. Like a love that is not, when you love someone and you're not being loved back. Because we asked the question, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? I have a positive feeling about Christianity, secularization, Islam. So the people who ticked in that they have a positive or very positive feeling for these 3 respective traditions then, it fell out like this. So we can see, for instance, that Islam, among Muslims who are Islam-affirming, believing, practicing Muslims, 50% of them have positive or very positive feelings for Christianity. Whereas the Christianity-affirming Christians, to a very low extent, have positive feelings for Islam. So it's like, we love you, but they don't love them back. In the data, the overwhelmingly most non-liked tradition is Islam. And those who dislike Islam the most are the post-Christians, secular post-Christians, but the secular post-Muslims are not far behind. And if you look at those who ticked in that they really dislike Islam, we can see that we have the largest number among the secular post-Christians, but then we have the secular post-Muslims. So the Muslims don't like Islam at all, and no one actually likes Islam very much except, obviously, the Islam-affirming Muslims, who all liked it very much. So you can speak of almost a very negative understanding of your own family heritage in terms of religious heritage. And in this question, and also in many other questions that we've asked, the group that stands out in terms of answer patterns and beliefs and ideas and practices and many things actually is the Islam-affirming Muslims. They are clearly different from the others in many respects. Okay. Third finding, the Muslims, if we by the Muslims now mean those people who came walking and in the Pew Institute report were represented as becoming 20% of the Swedish population, the Muslims are largely secular. I will show you now a chart of how the Christians, okay, now you have to pay attention, how the post-Christian, or people with a Christian family background, their feelings about Christianity. So this is agreement with dimensions of Christianity among people with Christianity in their family. And basically you can't read this, but you should look at the green and yellow parts of these bars. So the first one is, to what extent do you celebrate Christian holidays? And the people with a Christian, family background, 85% of them claim to celebrate Christian holidays. Many of them had Christian values, said they had a Christian family background, a Christian upbringing, felt a commitment to a church and so on. So the sort of non-Christian, the red bars, are the larger part of the chart. but they are not overly negative to Christianity. They have some kind of affinity. And remember that these now are the people that are located in the top right corner in this World Value Survey map. Now compare this chart to the equivalent chart of the people with a Muslim family background. Massive, a much smaller degree of agreeing with Islamic traditions or feeling affinity to it and having a Muslim faith and having Muslim values and so on and so forth. And now maybe we were thinking, okay, so maybe we are too strict in our definition because this is the definition, what religions do you have in your family? And maybe we should put it stricter. So we took another score, which was people who had Muslim parents or grandparents, and then we find this. So this is a stricter definition of Muslim, or having a Muslim family background. And then we took another definition of the Muslims. We took those who celebrated Eid the last year. And then we get this. So only 25% of those who said they celebrate Eid claim to have celebrated Muslim holidays. If we ask, do you call yourself a Muslim? This is the result with people with a Muslim family background. Less than 10% call themselves Muslim, and about 10% say that others see them as Muslim. So they seem to have a very strong connection, much stronger connection to the secular than to the Islamic. And then we can ask ourselves, does the category of Muslims collapse? And we can ask, what motivates, speaking of the Muslims, as in the Pew Institute report and in many other occasions, what motivates speaking of the Muslims as Muslims? And let me then say something just about categories, the categories that we use. Because, of course, there are different reasons to use categories. There are theological reasons. If this had been a conference about in Sharia jurisprudence, for instance, it would be obvious for us to use the category of Muslim, because Muslim and non-Muslim are sort of legal categories in Sharia jurisprudence. It might also be political reasons to use this, or, you could have political or theological or whatever reasons to use the category of the Muslims. But as academic scholars studying the phenomenon of religion from an empirical sort of point of view, is it really motivated? This is the question I want to ask. And then we have to ask, when are categories motivated to use? And one way, of course, all categorizations, all analytical categories will be simplifications of reality somehow. There will always be sort of border cases where the categories really don't work and reality is always much more complex. But at least I think it's a fair idea to say that a category at least should be somehow sort of reflect something that exists in reality. The category that you describe should sustain itself empirically. And if the case is such that a category that you use, an analytical category, says more about your own presupposition than about the people you are studying, then this is not a good analytical category for the scientific study of religion. I don't know if you agree. And in that case, what should be then what are the evidence for speaking of the Muslims as Muslim? Could it be family background? Well, this was the chart that I showed you earlier. A massive denial of Islamic dimensions of Islam among those who allegedly or claim to have a Muslim family background. So that doesn't really work. Could it be the connection then to traditions? What traditions you celebrate? The Muslims are those who celebrate, the Muslim traditions. I should also say about the family background that many of those who had a Muslim family background also had a Christian family background, because they have, they come from Bosnia and they are mixed marriages, so they have many religions in their backgrounds. So that didn't work. So how about traditions? Actually, 90% of those who celebrate Eid in our survey also celebrate Christmas, and 71% also celebrate Easter. Almost all of the half of those who celebrate Eid said that it's absolutely unimportant for them what religious connotations this festival has. So traditions don't really seem to work as a way to categorize the Muslims. So maybe engagement in congregations. But here, there is absolutely no evidence, at least not in this data set, because not even those who were Islam-affirming Muslims had a strong engagement in congregations or felt a strong affinity to Muslim organizations and congregations. So how about adherence to Islamic authorities? In this data set, the Muslims and Muslim family background people are as individualist as the rest of the data set. How about relations to the secular? Well, if you want to follow this data set, the argument would be that the Muslims are the ones with a stronger relation to the secular, which would be a strange thing to define the category of Muslims through. So these are the relation to the secular things. These are people with Muslim family background. To what extent they have, secular values, feel that they have a secular lifestyle, have a secular worldview, have a secular upbringing, and so on. The greener parts of the bars are bigger than the red. These are the feelings for Christianity, secularization, and Islam among people with a Muslim family background in our data set. Strongest positive feeling for secularization. We even asked, what do you perceive is the norm concerning religion in today's Sweden? What is the norm concerning religion? And here there was agreement throughout the data set that the norm is to be non-religious, to be secular and such things. And then we asked, to what extent do you agree with the norms concerning religion? And here the people with the Muslim family background, the post-Muslims, felt that they fit the norm, the secular norm of Sweden, to a larger extent than those who have a post-Christian background. And they did this even though actually they didn't, because on belief they scored a little bit higher. So they didn't really fit the norm to the extent that they felt that they did, but they felt that they did. They wanted to show that we feel the norms, perhaps, that we feel the norm. So relation to the secular becomes an awkward thing to define this category. If we then finally ask ourselves whether belief and self-ascription could be a good way to define the Muslims as Muslims, this would work. Because if you look at those who call themselves Muslim and who claim to have a Muslim belief, they actually form a group which is there in the data. It's the fourth cluster that I showed you, the Islam-affirming Muslims. They seem to answer in similar patterns in many ways, so they strongly sort of belong together as an empirically provable cluster in this data set. So that would be a thing, to define the Muslims as those who have a Muslim belief and a Muslim self-ascription. And I will come back to them shortly. As a fifth and final finding from this study, I want to discuss what could be an empirically based definition of Muslims, according to this data set. And when we set out to do this, we had this idea of the cultural Muslim. A bit like, we have the cultural Post-Lutherans who, they go to church a little bit and they like some hymns and they're not religious, but they have some cultural affinity. That could have been defined, then we could have defined, thought we would have been able to define Muslims as people with a Muslim family background who celebrate Islamic holidays and maintain a cultural affinity to Islam. We find these people in the data set, but they are much, much fewer than we had anticipated. If you compare, the left side are the Christian cultural background, the right one in Muslim family background. So the cultural Christian, you could argue for a cultural Christian based on the left chart, but could you really argue for a cultural Muslim other than a small cultural Muslim group based on the right chart? Not as easily, at least. So instead of speaking of a cultural Muslim, given the fact that they were so positive to secularization, maybe we should speak about secular Muslims, which would make sense then, given the fact that they agreed with different dimensions of secularity to a much larger extent. Or perhaps, so this is, if you compare how much these people then, people with a Muslim family background, agreed with Muslim dimensions and secular dimensions. There's much larger affirmative stance concerning the secular dimensions. Or perhaps we could use another term, which would be involuntary Muslim. They are quite prominent in the data. Okay, they are Muslim, but they don't want to be it. Or perhaps Muslim by ascription. I mean, being that category of people that, Muslim leaders and anti-immigration politicians and researchers categorize as Muslim whether they want it or not. But if we, based on this data set, want to make a sort of empirically grounded definition of Muslims, then we have two definitions, two suggestions then, based on this empirical data. And one is a narrow definition, and that would be that Muslims are people who define themselves as Muslim and assert to having a Muslim belief. This is something that we can find in the data. But this definition does not describe the Muslims of the demographic statistics or the popular understanding. And many of them are converts, actually. So these Muslims, if we use this definition of Muslims, well, then it's not these Muslims we're talking about. Then it's a smaller category. And if we're unsatisfied with such a small and narrow definition of Muslims, well, then we can have a wider definition, but then we cannot actually define it as Muslims, but perhaps of Muslim culture in Sweden. And then we can describe this as a category of practice and discourse into which people of differing identities, beliefs, and family heritage come and go. So if I go and celebrate Eid with some Muslim friends, then I will enter into this category of practice and discourse that is Islam for a little while, or Muslim culture for a little while. And then I go to my football game and play some soccer, and then I will enter to the category of soccer. And if you think of Islam as a category of practice, well, then it becomes a bit like sports or gardening or academic work. It's something that's there, it has its specific forms, its specific discourse, its specific practices, but the borders of this category do not run alongside groups of actual people, but cut through them. So, according to our data set. And I just want to end by saying that as we are living in a time when the calls for polarization are heard from many different parts of society. And there is a polarized debate where we are urged by the political climate to think of people in fixed categories, and our categories, the religious categories, have become a part in this political call for polarization. And I think it's an important task for us as scholars of religion not to feed into that call, but to use categories that can be empirically grounded. And I hope this is a contribution to this. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, David, for this inspiring lecture, and thank you for destroying another analytical category. I believe we have a lot of questions. We have some time for that. Please.
David Kim from ANU Australia. Thanks for your presentation. Wonderful time to learn about those phenomena in Sweden. When I was listening to your talk, it was very interesting. You talk about Christianity in Sweden through the case of the Lutheran, and then you talk about Muslims through the case of those different countries' background, Iran, Iraq, and those background, and you categorized 4 different groups. As I was listening, I was wondering if you have you ever thought about you could also categorize in different ways in terms of considering gender, considering age, considering regions, where there's, for example, genders, when you consider Muslim groups, male and female may be different, not only Muslim, but also ordinary Swedish people. Also another category could be LGBTI groups. And then when you consider age, it could be the teenage group might have a different idea. Middle class working 20 to 40 or 50 years old people might have a different idea, or retired people might have a different idea. Also, if we consider regionally, maybe south side of Sweden, northern side of Sweden, or Stockholm, people might have a different idea.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And one of the benefits, actually, of my very bureaucratic country is that we have really good register data. So when we will do the postal survey, we will be able not only to analyze the responses that we get in based on all these categories that you mentioned, but we will also be able to see, I mean, the age and gender and regional, the big city, small city, all kinds of different variables of those who did not answer. And that will be a very important complement to this, to the results I told you about here.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I was wondering about the concept that you mentioned a lot but didn't emphasize much, I guess, which is religion. In the part when you described your research, it was kind of implied that it's a generic term which includes inclusive of Christianity and Islam. But I was wondering about the first part where you were talking about the narratives in the Swedish society. Would you say it's something more than that? Because if we're talking about Pentecostals, for instance, and evangelicals in general, they consider often, if not always, consider religion as something almost pejorative, right? They say it's a legalistic part of, a legalistic kind of confessing your faith, as opposed to the real faith, to the real commitment and giving your heart to Christ. Thank you.
Yes, that's an important question, of course. I don't use religion as an analytical category, sort of as this is what I'm studying religion, but I use it as an emic. If you think of the first part, this post-Christian majority culture, I use religion as an emic term that is used by the informants in this group, which would be something that they don't have, but which is there as something that others have. And I have not focused on the Pentecostals themselves as a minority movement in this study, although I have actually written other things about Pentecostals, but that is outside the scope of this talk. So for me, religion is an emic category only.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask if the fact that the use of category of Muslim influenced the way Christians categorize themselves as Christian. I'm thinking about school system, for example. If in school religion is being taught and you learn in Swedish schools about different religions and suddenly you have actual Muslims sitting in class when you teach about Islam, does it influence the way Christians see themselves and define themselves? Maybe it's connected to the gentleman question about age differences. Maybe with the young generation, people tend to say more, we are Christian because we heard that the Muslims say that they're Muslims.
That's a very good question, and I think this is definitely the case. One thing to prove that sort of statistically or in this type of survey studies is that if you ask people in Scandinavia, are you Christian, atheist, or non-religious, and you give these alternatives, people will tick in non-religious. But if you ask, are you Christian, Muslim, Jewish, people will tick in Christian. So the way you ask will define the answer you get. And of course, this is one of the problems in a situation that if the sort of well-meaning majority culture, which is largely secular, imposes this category on also children in school. So imagine you have a classroom situation and you read about this different religions and there are different boxes that people can be placed in, and suddenly you have this Muslim student who is sort of a representative of this category, whether he or she wants it or not. So that's a very important aspect.
Kim Knott, Lancaster University. Forgive me if I've remembered wrongly or I'm being really stupid here, which is quite possible. I so enjoyed your talk and I found it very, very persuasive. And then I have already really forgotten what the category of inclusion was in the survey in the first place, which I believe was something to do with family background. Can you just remind me? I could answer that both for this study that we've done and also for the Pew research No, I know what it is in the Pew Research.
Okay,
let
okay.
me explain why
yeah.
I'm asking. Because if people have already opted in on the basis of some kind of definition of family background, then oughtn't that have some implications on how you then interpret the results?
Yes.
Maybe my question is meaningless, but...
No, it's important, and it's a very sort of to the point methodological problem. But what we did was we decided that of all the different dimensions of religion that you could take as your sort of independent variable, we picked family background. So the broadest possible, we wanted all the people who could in any vague way be defined as Muslims. In the Pew research study, it's based on how people have answered, at least in the case of Sweden, in what religion were you raised? This is the question that those figures were based on. So we asked, what religions are there in your family today and in previous generations? And you could tick in several options. So this was our way of trying to get the broadest possible sort of group into this, because we were interested not in the strongly Muslim people, but people of a Muslim family background.
So doesn't that then have some implications for for the categorizations that you then end up with? So don't you need somehow or other to take that variable into consideration? So family background, I still feel that you have not really ruled out family background. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say, given that you started with it as a key aspect of narrowing the sample in the first place.
Yes, but how would you do it? Because you need you need some kind of definition as a starting point. You need some independent variable to start anything. Or we could just take a random sample of Swedish people, for instance, and just ask them and see what they would come up with. But what would have happened then would have been that we would have had so desperately few Muslims. So we needed to take, out of these 60,000 volunteers, we needed to take as many people with a Muslim family background as possible.
Yeah, which is great. I don't have an objection at all to that. I'm just saying, is that the fact that we then lose all these categories at the end, should we not still be retaining some sense of family background in that process of elimination, given that those are the people we started with?
Yeah.
I may be just...
One argument for that would be that there are actually those who, strikingly, those who most strongly fulfill the criteria of sort of the stereotypical Muslim, as it's portrayed in media and so on, who have a strong belief, who feel that they're outsiders in society, who feel that there's all kinds of criteria of some kind of stereotypical Muslim, are people who don't have a Muslim family background. And so one group that we miss out with this method are people who are converts. And they are sometimes the strongest. I mean, we all know how converts usually are. They are the ones sort of fulfilling the idea of the religion they have converted to most strongly. So, but we have been thinking a lot about how to go about this, and we ended up by deciding to actually use some kind of category to get more informants. Yeah.
Yeah, Paula Schrode from University of Bayreuth, Germany. Here I am.
Oh,
See
yeah.
me? Okay, yeah, stand up. Yeah, one more question concerning the family background. Can you say something in regards of countries of origin, especially how large is the share of respondents from Iran? That would be interesting to know.
Yes, unfortunately I cannot, because we were not allowed by the ethical committee to ask about national background. So we only have regional backgrounds, and they are too vague to say something. They consider it too possible to de-anonymize the informants if we had asked about countries. But there are previous studies that indicate that there are huge country differences. And I think this is also my intuitive feeling about this. And Iranians are probably one of the most anti-Islamic group that we have, if you think in terms of nationalities. So maybe they are the ones that are coming through. But they are also one of the biggest culturally Muslim communities that we have in Sweden.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Here at the front.
Oh, yeah, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Muhammad Israel, from Israel. I was wondering how secular Muslims behave in terms of personal affairs such as marriage and divorce. We don't have statistics on this question from this survey. But I would guess that some of them, depending on then how you define them, but some of them might, for instance, Iranians, if I take the Iranian group, which I know a little bit about from other studies, some of them have to actually use religious instances, Islamic instances, even in Sweden, because to sort out family issues, because it's related to the Iranian system. Otherwise, there are, of course, non-secular instances for all kinds of both marriage and divorce and such things. I don't know to what extent the percentage of people who use one and the other, but it's an interesting question, but I don't have the data for this.
Okay, and the last question, please.
Yeah, is this on? Yeah, thank you so much. Ehsan Qureshi from University of Tampere, Finland. So I took a picture of the graphs that you had over here, and really interesting. So we have these different dimensions of how we would categorize a Muslim. I was wondering if there was any benchmark definition for what you would term as secular. Was there a definition for what is secular? How did the respondents thought of this as secular? Because in my own personal interactions, for example, I mean, it's taken for granted at times, and both pro and against, they have their own different definitions towards secular.
Yes.
So what was the benchmark definition for the survey?
So we divide both Islam, Christianity, and the secular into 13 different variables. So, and we ask about each of them in different ways. And actually, one of the other findings is that secular doesn't really work as an analytical category in the same way as Islam and Christianity does. Because what's the difference between saying I'm highly secular and saying I'm not at all Christian? So it's a difficult category. But what we've asked is basically things like, do you have, we have asked parallel questions to the questions we asked about the religions. So do we have a secular upbringing? Are the holidays you celebrate secular? Do you have secular values? Do you have a secular family background? So all the things that we also ask about Islam and Christianity. So we don't actually impose a definition of secularity, but we are trying to find it from the data. And we also have a question which is, what are your first associations to these three, the secular, Islam and Christianity, to see from the data what people put into it. And one of the problems with the secular is, the term secular, is that it's kind of academic. So some of the people just don't grasp it, which makes it a difficult category to study. But you need to put it in there, because in a country like Sweden, if you don't ask about secular things, people will drop out of the survey. If you ask, are you Christian, are you Muslim, they'll say, this is not about me, and they'll stop answering. So you have to ask sort of, are you atheist or secular, to make people feel that this is a questionnaire that deals with their lives, to make them more, to keep them on the hook. So there are many reasons to include it, but not only analytical.
Okay, I see there are actually more questions, but it has been a long day and our time is actually up. So thank you, David, and thank you everyone.
Thank you.